The crystal stemware caught the amber light from the chandeliers as Jinwoo Park lifted his wine glass with practiced precision. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, the way a man learned to exist when survival depended on control. The restaurant hummed with the quiet elegance of Seattle's most exclusive establishment, where reservations required both wealth and influence, where privacy was purchased along with perfect Wagyu and aged Bordeaux. He sat alone at table 12, though alone was relative when 3 security personnel occupied strategic positions throughout the dining room. To the casual observer, they were simply well-dressed men enjoying expensive meals. Jinwoo knew better. In his world, alone meant vulnerable, and vulnerable meant dead. The waitress approached with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating between tables without disturbing the carefully orchestrated atmosphere. Maya-chan, according to her name tag, though Jinwoo suspected that surname was as carefully chosen as everything else in this establishment. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of discipline, her dark eyes scanning the room in a pattern too systematic to be casual observation. Those watching tonight, and there are always watchers when power dines in public, would you recognize danger when it walks through your city's most prestigious doors? She asked, setting down his second course with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the subtle tension radiating from her shoulders. Jinwoo studied her face as she arranged the plate with military precision. Interesting. Most service staff in establishments like this possessed a particular kind of trained invisibility, becoming background fixtures that wealthy patrons barely acknowledged. This woman commanded attention without seeking it, her presence both professional and somehow protective. The scent of her perfume, something clean and understated, mixed with the aroma of seared duck breast. She had positioned herself at an angle that allowed her to monitor both his table and the main entrance, a detail that would escape most diners but spoke volumes to someone who understood tactical awareness. Maya stepped back from the table, her movements fluid and controlled. The way she held herself reminded Jinwoo of former military, the kind of posture that never fully relaxed, even in civilian settings. Her eyes met his briefly, professionally polite but alert in a way that suggested she saw more than she should. The first sign of trouble was the change in atmospheric pressure. Not literal, but the kind experienced predators learn to recognize when apex competitors enter their territory. Jinwoo felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift in energy that preceded violence. The front entrance exploded inward. 5 men in dark clothing burst through the shattered glass doors, their faces covered by tactical masks, weapons already drawn. The restaurant erupted into chaos as civilians screamed and dove for cover beneath tables. Crystal crashed against marble as patrons scrambled for exits that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. Jinwoo's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon beneath his jacket, but Maya was already in motion. She dropped into a defensive crouch beside his table, her entire demeanor transforming from service professional to combat operative in the space of a heartbeat. The change was so complete it seemed like watching 2 different people occupy the same body. "Get down," she commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Her eyes tracked the attacker's movements with predatory precision, calculating angles and distances with the speed of someone trained for exactly this scenario. The lead gunman spotted Jinwoo immediately, raising his weapon with professional competence. Maya moved between them without hesitation, overturning the heavy dining table to create improvised cover. The solid oak surface absorbed the first burst of automatic gunfire, with splintering as bullets carved deep grooves into its polished surface. Jinwoo found himself pressed against the floor behind makeshift shelter, watching this woman he had known for less than 20 minutes risk her life to protect his. The absurdity of the situation struck him even as adrenaline flooded his system. A waitress, transforming into a bodyguard with skills that rivaled his own security team. Maya's hand emerged from beneath her server's apron holding a ceramic steak knife, the only weapon available in a restaurant dining room. Against 5 armed men, It should have been laughably inadequate. Instead, she held it with the confidence of someone who understood that lethality had less to do with equipment and more to do with training and willingness to use whatever tools presented themselves. "Stay behind the table," she ordered, already moving before he could respond. She launched herself toward the nearest attacker with explosive speed, using the element of surprise that came from being underestimated. The gunman's attention had been focused on Jin Woo, expecting resistance from his security team, not from restaurant staff. By the time he registered the threat, Maya was already inside his effective range. The ceramic blade found the gap between his vest and helmet with surgical precision. The man dropped, his weapon clattering across the marble floor. Maya retrieved it in a single fluid motion, her movements economical and deadly. The remaining 4 attackers adjusted their strategy instantly, recognizing they faced trained opposition. 2 flanked left while the others maintained forward pressure, executing a coordinated assault pattern that spoke of military or paramilitary training. Maya rolled behind the bar, using the solid structure for cover as bullets shattered bottles of vintage spirits behind her. The air filled with the scent of expensive alcohol and gunpowder, a combination that would forever remind Jin Woo of the moment his carefully controlled world collided with something utterly unexpected. His security team finally arrived, bursting through the kitchen entrance with the kind of overwhelming force that ended conflicts quickly. The remaining attackers found themselves caught in a crossfire between Maya's position and professional operators who had been trained to neutralize threats with extreme prejudice. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds. When the silence settled over the restaurant like dust after an explosion, 5 bodies lay still among the wreckage of what had been Seattle's most exclusive dining establishment. Crystal and blood painted abstract patterns across marble that would require complete renovation to ever feel safe again. Maya emerged from behind the bar, weapon lowered but still ready, her dark eyes scanning for additional threats that might materialize from the shadows. Her server's uniform was torn and stained, but she moved without favor or obvious injury, adrenaline keeping pain at bay for now. Jinwoo rose slowly from behind the overturned table, his own weapon finally drawn, though events had moved too quickly for him to use it effectively. His security chief was already coordinating with arriving police, but Jinwoo's attention remained fixed on the woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that defied every assumption he had made about her. She looked at him across the devastation, her breathing controlled despite the violence that had just erupted around them. The transformation he had witnessed was beginning to reverse, the combat operative receding behind the professional mask of a service worker, but not completely. Something fundamental had been revealed that could never be hidden again. "You are hurt," he observed, noting the way she favored her left shoulder where she had hit the floor during her initial defensive movement. Maya straightened, ignoring the injury with the kind of practiced disregard that spoke of previous wounds and the knowledge that acknowledging pain was a luxury that could wait until safety was secured. "I am fine," she replied, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested the adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by the realization of what had just occurred and what it might mean for her future. Jinwoo studied her face, seeing past the professional composure to the intelligence and strength that had just saved his life. In his world, such demonstrations of capability were rare and valuable. They were also dangerous for anyone not already protected by the complex web of loyalties and obligations that governed organized crime. This woman had just entered his world, whether she understood it or not. The question now was whether she would survive what came next. The police station smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the luxury Maya had left behind in the restaurant wreckage. Detective Sarah Morrison sat across from her in the interrogation room, pen poised over a legal pad that already bore 2 hours' worth of testimony about the events that had transformed an ordinary Tuesday evening into something that would define the rest of Maya's life. She recounted the attack for the 3rd time, maintaining the careful narrative she had constructed during the ambulance ride. Self-defense training from her college years, she explained when pressed about her combat effectiveness. A few martial arts classes, the kind of thing any woman living alone in the city might pursue for personal safety. The detective's skeptical expression suggested she found Maya's explanation as convincing as a child claiming the cat had eaten their homework, but without contradictory evidence. The official record would reflect heroic civilian intervention rather than the tactical precision of someone trained to neutralize threats with lethal efficiency. Maya wondered if there are others watching tonight from cities where danger wears expensive suits, if they understand how quickly an ordinary life can become extraordinary when violence breaks through the carefully maintained barriers between worlds that were never meant to intersect. Through the station's grimy windows, she could see expensive sedans parked along the street, their engines running and windows tinted dark enough to conceal passengers who preferred anonymity. Jinwa's people, she realized, maintaining overwatch even in a building full of police officers. The realization sent ice through her veins, not from fear, but from the dawning understanding that her actions in the restaurant had consequences that extended far beyond a single evening of violence. Detective Morrison closed her notebook with the decisive snap of someone eager to file paperwork and move on to crimes that made more conventional sense. Maya signed her statement with hands that no longer trembled. Adrenaline finally metabolized into the kind of exhaustion that settled into bones and stayed there. The lobby of the police station buzzed with the familiar chaos of urban law enforcement, but Maya's attention focused immediately on the figure waiting near the information desk. Jinwoo Park stood with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the evening's violence, his presence creating a subtle bubble of space that even armed police officers unconsciously respected. He approached her with the measured pace of a predator, not hunting, but certainly aware of every potential threat in his environment. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something darker reached her before he spoke, triggering a visceral memory of the moment she had pressed him to the floor behind makeshift cover. "Miss Chun," he said, his voice carrying the kind of formality that suggested English was not his native language despite his obvious fluency. "I trust your interview with the police was satisfactory." Maya studied his face, noting the way his dark eyes seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance, from the small bandage on her temple to the tear in her uniform sleeve. There was something predatory in his attention, but also something protective that made her feel simultaneously threatened and safe. "They seemed satisfied with my explanation," she replied carefully, uncertain how much he had overheard or what connections he might have within the police department that could provide him with information about her statement. Jinwoo nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Former Army," he said without preamble. "2 tours in Afghanistan. Specialized training in close-quarters combat and threat neutralization. Honorable discharge 3 years ago, following an incident that left you with a medical retirement and a desire to disappear from official records." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. The carefully constructed civilian identity she had built over the past 3 years crumbled in the space between his words, revealing the trained killer she had tried so desperately to bury beneath layers of normalcy and service industry anonymity. "How did you find out?" she asked, though the question was rhetorical. Men like Jinwoo Park did not survive in their chosen profession without access to information that existed in databases supposedly protected by federal security protocols. "The same way I know that you have been living under an assumed identity, that Maya Chun is a fabrication designed to hide Maya Williams, and that someone with your particular skill set does not end up serving tables by accident," he replied with the confidence of someone holding all the cards in a game she had not realized she was playing. They walked through the police station lobby side by side, his hand hovering near her elbow in a gesture that appeared protective but carried undertones of possession. Maya found herself hyper-aware of his proximity, the way his presence seemed to command attention from everyone they passed, the subtle deference shown by officers who probably had no idea who he was but recognized authority when they encountered it. The night air outside felt sharp and clean compared to the institutional atmosphere of the police station. Jinwoo's security team materialized from their positions with military precision, creating a protective formation that guided them toward a black sedan that spoke of bulletproof glass and armor plating beneath its pristine exterior. "You saved my life tonight," Jinwoo continued as they approached the vehicle. "In my world, that creates certain obligations, both for protection and repayment. Unfortunately, it also creates certain dangers for anyone foolish enough to intervene in matters that were not their concern." Maya stopped walking, forcing the entire formation to halt on the sidewalk outside the police station. She turned to face him directly, meeting his gaze with the kind of steady assessment that had served her well in combat zones where weakness meant death and hesitation could doom entire units. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice carrying the edge that had once commanded respect from soldiers under impossible circumstances. His smile widened, revealing appreciation for her directness. "I am informing you that 5 men died tonight attempting to kill me, and that their associates will undoubtedly investigate how their carefully planned assassination failed so completely. When they discover that a restaurant waitress demonstrated combat capabilities sufficient to neutralize trained operatives, they will conclude that you are either law enforcement or military intelligence operating undercover to protect me." The implications hit Maya like physical blows. Her carefully constructed new life, the anonymity she had purchased with 3 years of deliberate mediocrity, the safety that came from being invisible in a world that had tried to destroy her. All of it compromised by 30 seconds of instinctive action that had revealed training she could never fully suppress. "Which means," Jinwoo continued, stepping closer until she could smell the sandalwood scent that seemed to cling to his skin, "that you are now a target. My enemies will assume you know things about my organization, my operations, my vulnerabilities. They will attempt to extract this information using methods that make battlefield interrogation seem gentle by comparison." Maya felt the walls of her new life crumbling around her, revealing the harsh landscape of a world she thought she had escaped. The irony was not lost on her that attempting to protect one dangerous man had destroyed the protection of obscurity that had kept her alive since leaving the army. "What are you proposing?" she asked, though part of her already understood the trap that was closing around her with the inexorable precision of a perfectly executed military operation. Jinwoo gestured toward the sedan, where his security team waited with the patience of professionals accustomed to their employers' negotiations. "Employment," he said simply. "I find myself in need of a personal security consultant, someone with your particular combination of training and motivation. The compensation would be substantial, the accommodations luxurious, and the protection absolute." Maya looked at the car, understanding that stepping inside would represent a choice that could never be undone. The man before her was offering her safety, but safety that came with chains, protection that required surrender of the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. "And if I refuse?" she asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear him say it. "Then you will be dead within the week," he replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truths about gravity or mathematics. "My enemies are thorough, and they do not leave loose ends that might threaten their operations in the future." The sedan's engine purred with expensive precision, waiting to carry her toward a future that will be defined by luxury and danger in equal measure. Maya thought about her small apartment across town, about the life she had built from nothing, about the careful anonymity that had been her only protection against a world that had tried to break her. All of it was gone now, destroyed by a moment of instinctive heroism that had revealed the warrior she could never completely bury. She walked toward the car, each step a conscious choice to enter Jinwoo's world on terms that had been dictated by circumstance rather than preference. He opened the door for her with old-fashioned courtesy, but she could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the recognition of a valuable asset that had been acquired through a combination of necessity and opportunity. The interior smelled of leather and power, expensive cologne, and the subtle scent of gun oil that reminded her this was a vehicle designed for war as much as transportation. As they pulled away from the police station, Maya caught her reflection in the bulletproof window and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The waitress was gone. What remained was someone who would have to learn to navigate a world where protection and possession were often indistinguishable, where survival required accepting help from men who were themselves weapons forged by necessity and shaped by violence. Jinwoo sat beside her in comfortable silence, but she could feel his attention like heat against her skin, the way a predator might study prey that had proven more interesting than expected. The city lights blurred past outside, carrying her away from everything familiar toward a future that would be defined by choices she had not yet learned to make. The penthouse suite occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Emerald Tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay that spoke of power measured in altitude and unobstructed sightlines. Maya stood at the glass wall, studying the security implications of such exposure, while Jinwoo's team assembled around a conference table that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. She had slept 4 hours in a bedroom that resembled a luxury hotel suite, complete with Egyptian cotton sheets and a view that made her feel suspended between earth and sky. The clothes waiting in the walk-in closet had fit perfectly, tailored pieces in dark colors that managed to be both professional and flattering, as if someone had studied her measurements with the precision of a military quartermaster. The security briefing was already in progress when she joined the meeting, 5 men in expensive suits discussing threat assessments and protective protocols with the casual efficiency of professionals who had been working together for years. They acknowledged her presence with polite nods, but their body language suggested skepticism about her qualifications despite the previous evening's demonstration. Jinwoo sat at the head of the table, his attention focused on a detailed floor plan of some corporate building downtown. He wore a navy suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. When he looked up to include her in the discussion, Maya felt that familiar jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with professional assessment and everything to do with the way his presence seemed to command attention without effort. "Miss Chun," he said, his formal tone establishing distance that felt deliberate after the intimacy of their conversation the night before. "We are discussing security arrangements for tomorrow's board meeting. Perhaps you would care to offer your professional assessment." Maya approached the table, aware that this was some kind of test designed to measure her value beyond her demonstrated combat capabilities. The floor plan showed a modern office building with multiple access points, underground parking, and the kind of open architectural design that prioritized aesthetic appeal over defensive considerations. She studied the layout for 30 seconds, her mind automatically calculating angles and vulnerabilities with the systematic thoroughness that had kept her alive in environments where enemies could emerge from any direction. The other men watched her with expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. "This building is a nightmare from a security perspective," she said finally, tracing potential threat vectors with her finger across the expensive paper. "Multiple access points, limited choke points, and whoever designed the executive floor prioritized natural light over cover and concealment. You would need at least 12 operatives to maintain adequate overwatch, and even then, you are vulnerable during transition from the parking garage to the elevator bank." The room fell silent. Maya looked up to find Jinwoo's security chief, a man introduced as Chinwoo, studying her with newfound respect. The others had stopped their casual dismissal and were paying attention with the kind of focus reserved for opinions that carried weight. "What would you recommend?" Jinwoo asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the testing tone she had expected. Maya turned back to the floor plan, her training automatically generating solutions to the tactical problems she had identified. "Change the venue," she said without hesitation. "Meet somewhere you control completely, where the defensive advantages favor your team rather than potential attackers. If that is not possible, then arrive early enough to place your people in overwatch positions, use decoy vehicles to confuse surveillance, and maintain multiple extraction routes that do not depend on the building's infrastructure." Chunwoo leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to professional interest. "She is right about the venue," he said to Jinwoo in Korean, apparently forgetting that Maya might understand the language. "This location requires too many resources to secure properly." Maya responded in fluent Korean, her pronunciation carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned the language for professional rather than cultural reasons. "Then perhaps we should consider the warehouse district property that offers better sight lines and fewer variables to manage." The silence that followed her linguistic demonstration was profound. Jinwoo's expression shifted from mild surprise to something approaching appreciation, while his security team exchanged glances that suggested they were reassessing their initial assumptions about her qualifications. "You speak Korean," Jinwoo observed, though it was clearly not a question. "Military intelligence requires certain linguistic capabilities," Maya replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I spent 18 months in Seoul during my service, working with ROK Army Special Operations Units on joint training exercises." The morning continued with Maya gradually integrating herself into security discussions that revealed the complex web of threats and obligations that defined Jinwoo's daily existence. She found herself offering tactical advice that was received with increasing respect, her suggestions implemented with the kind of deference usually reserved for established team members. But it was the small gestures that caught her attention. The way Jinwoo ensured she had coffee prepared exactly as she preferred, having somehow observed her habits during their brief interaction the previous evening. The subtle repositioning of his chair to include her more fully in the conversation circle. The careful attention to her comfort that spoke of consideration rather than mere politeness. When Jinwoo suggested she take point on advanced security for the relocated meeting, Maya felt a surge of professional satisfaction that had nothing to do with Jinwoo's approval and everything to do with being recognized for skills she had thought she would never use again. The security team dispersed to implement the new arrangements, leaving Maya alone with Jinwoo in the conference room that suddenly felt much smaller despite its generous proportions. He remained seated at the table, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of the way sunlight from the windows caught the dark silk of her blouse. "You have surprised my men," he said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "They expected competence, but they did not expect strategic thinking at the level you demonstrated." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, pleased by the recognition despite herself. She had spent 3 years deliberately suppressing the intellectual challenges that had made military service rewarding, forcing herself to blend into civilian mediocrity that felt like wearing clothes 3 sizes too small. "I was not hired to serve coffee and look decorative," she replied, then immediately regretted the defensive edge in her voice that revealed more than she had intended about her frustration with being underestimated. Jinwoo stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the faint scar along his jaw that suggested his own history with violence. "No," he said quietly, "you are not. But you must understand that in my world, trust is earned through demonstrated loyalty as much as demonstrated competence." Maya looked up at him, noting the way his formal facade seemed to crack slightly when they were alone, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the carefully constructed authority. There was something lonely in his dark eyes, a weight that spoke of responsibilities that could never be fully shared. "And what would such loyalty require?" she asked, aware that they were discussing something more complex than professional obligations. Before he could answer, his attention focused on the small bandage at her temple, a reminder of her collision with a marble floor during the previous evening's violence. Without asking permission, he reached up to examine the dressing with gentle fingers that contrasted sharply with his reputation for ruthless efficiency. Maya held perfectly still, hyper-aware of his proximity and the unexpected tenderness in his touch. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the careful precision with which he checked the wound for signs of infection or improper healing. "This should be properly cleaned and redressed," he said, his voice carrying genuine concern that surprised her. "I have medical supplies in my office." She followed him down a hallway lined with artwork that probably represented more wealth than she had ever seen in one place, trying to ignore the way his presence seemed to fill the space around them. His office was a study in controlled luxury, dark wood and leather furniture arranged with the same tactical awareness that governed his security arrangements. Jinwoo retrieved a first aid kit from a concealed cabinet, his movements economical and practiced. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing toward the leather sofa that dominated one wall of the office. Maya perched on the edge of the cushions, intensely aware of his proximity as he knelt beside her to examine the injury at eye level. His touch was gentle but professional, the kind of clinical competence that suggested he had tended wounds before, though probably not under circumstances that could be described as tender. "You were hurt protecting me," he said quietly, his breath warm against her skin as he carefully removed the old bandage. "In my culture, that creates certain obligations that cannot be discharged with money or employment opportunities." Maya found herself studying the concentration in his face as he cleaned the wound with antiseptic that stung enough to make her wince slightly. There was something almost meditative in his attention to detail, as if caring for her injury was a form of penance for allowing her to be harmed in the first place. "What kind of obligations?" she asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. Jinwoo paused in his ministrations, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the minor wound he was treating. "The kind that lasts much longer than the healing process," he replied, his voice carrying undertones that suggested they were discussing something far more significant than medical care. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the moment felt too fragile for direct questions. Instead, she found herself studying his face, noting the way his usually controlled expression had softened into something approaching vulnerability. The new bandage was applied with the same careful attention, his fingers lingering against her skin longer than strictly necessary. When he finally sat back, the professional distance between them had been replaced by something electric and dangerous. "Tell me about your family," Maya said suddenly, desperate to break the tension before it led them somewhere neither was prepared to navigate. Jinwoo returned to his chair behind the desk, but the physical distance did not diminish the awareness that seemed to crackle between them like static electricity before a storm. "My father built this organization from nothing," he said after a long moment, his voice taking on the formal cadence he used for business discussions. "When he died, I inherited not just wealth and power, but obligations to hundreds of people whose livelihoods depend on decisions I make every day." Maya heard the weight in his voice, the burden of leadership that could never be set aside. "And your mother?" she asked gently. "She wanted me to be a doctor," he replied with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "She thought medicine would be a more honorable way to use intelligence and steady hands." The humanizing detail hit Maya like a physical blow, revealing the man who might have existed in a different world, one where sons were not required to inherit their father's wars. She found herself imagining him in surgical scrubs instead of tailored suits, saving lives instead of taking them. "And you?" he asked, his gaze intent on her face. "What did your family want for you?" Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of the life she had left behind. "They wanted me safe," she said simply, "away from anything that might hurt me." The irony was not lost on either of them. In trying to protect one dangerous man, she had destroyed every protection her family's sacrifices had purchased for her. They sat in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through the office windows, casting geometric patterns across the expensive carpet. Maya found herself wondering what it would feel like to stay in this world permanently, to accept the luxury and danger as permanent conditions rather than temporary arrangements. The thought terrified her almost as much as it tempted her. "You should rest," Jinwoo said finally, though his voice carried reluctance. "Tonight will be demanding, and you will need to be at full capacity." Maya rose from the sofa, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them during their conversation. The professional distance he maintained was beginning to feel like protection for both of them rather than mere formality. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Maya," he said, using her real name for the first time since learning her true identity. She turned back to find him studying her with an expression that mixed appreciation with something that looked almost like regret. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." The words carried weight that went far beyond gratitude for medical assistance or tactical advice. Maya felt heat spread through her chest, dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious and unexpected. She left his office without responding, afraid that words might shatter whatever careful balance they had achieved between protection and possession, between professional necessity and personal desire. But she could still feel his gaze following her as she walked down the hallway toward her temporary sanctuary, and she knew with certainty that nothing between them would ever be simple again. The warehouse in the industrial district had been transformed into a fortress of glass and steel, its soaring ceilings and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere of controlled elegance that spoke of power confident enough to meet in unconventional venues. Maya stood at the observation deck overlooking the main floor, watching Jinwoo's security team implement the tactical recommendations she had developed over the past 3 days. Each position had been selected with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that could neutralize threats from any direction while maintaining plausible deniability about the defensive nature of the arrangements. To the visiting executives, it would appear to be an innovative corporate meeting space. To anyone with tactical training, it was a killing field designed to protect one man whose survival meant the difference between order and chaos in a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions. Jinwoo emerged from the communications center, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the industrial setting, his presence transforming the converted warehouse into something that felt more like a boardroom than a battlefield. He approached the observation platform with a measured pace she had learned to associate with his satisfaction when plans unfolded according to his specifications. "Your defensive positioning is flawless," he said, joining her at the railing that overlooked their prepared arena. "Jinwoo estimates we could hold this position against a coordinated assault by 20 operatives if necessary." Maya felt pride warm her chest at the recognition, the kind of professional satisfaction she had thought lost forever when she left military service. "It has been 3 years since I designed tactical solutions for real-world applications," she replied, surprised by how natural it felt to slip back into strategic thinking that could mean the difference between life and death. The past week had established a rhythm between them that felt both professional and intimate. Morning briefings over coffee that Jinwoo prepared himself, using an expensive espresso machine with the same precision he applied to everything else. Security planning sessions that had evolved into wide-ranging discussions about strategy, philosophy, and the complex moral calculations required to maintain power in a world where weakness invited destruction. Maya had found herself looking forward to these conversations with an anticipation that went far beyond professional engagement. Jinwoo possessed an intellect that matched his reputation for ruthless efficiency, but in private moments, she glimpsed the scholar he might have been in different circumstances, the thoughtful man who quoted Sun Tzu and Marcus Aurelius with equal fluency. "Tonight's meeting will determine the territorial boundaries for the next 5 years," Jinwoo continued, his gaze focused on the arriving vehicles that carried representatives from organizations whose names never appeared in legitimate business publications, but whose influence shaped entire industries. "Your security assessment convinced me to relocate from the original venue, a decision that may have prevented a repeat of the restaurant incident." Maya studied his profile as he spoke, noting the tension in his shoulders that suggested even his confidence in their preparations could not completely eliminate the stress of orchestrating negotiations where failure meant war. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotional state, the almost imperceptible changes in posture and expression that revealed the man beneath the carefully constructed facade. "Are you concerned about specific threats?" she asked, though she suspected his wariness had more to do with the general unpredictability of bringing powerful criminals together in one location than intelligence about planned attacks. Jinwoo turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of the way evening light from the skylights cast shadows across the observation deck. "In my world, every gathering is a potential threat," he said quietly. "Power abhors equilibrium, and men who have built empires through violence are always calculating whether cooperation serves them better than conquest." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Over the past week, she had watched him maintain perfect control in every interaction with his subordinates, projecting confidence that never wavered even when discussing life-threatening scenarios. This glimpse of uncertainty felt like a gift, trust offered to someone he had decided deserved access to his private thoughts. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Chunwoo appeared at the top of the platform stairs, his expression carrying the kind of focused urgency that preceded important tactical updates. "The Yamamoto delegation has arrived early," he reported in Korean, apparently still forgetting that Maya understood every word. "They brought twice the agreed-upon security complement and are requesting permission to inspect the venue before the other participants arrive." Jinwa's expression hardened into the mask Maya had learned to associate with business mode, all traces of vulnerability disappearing behind professional calculation. "Grant them limited access to the main floor," he replied in English, including Maya in the conversation with deliberate courtesy. "Ms. Chun will coordinate with their security chief to ensure they understand the boundaries of acceptable behavior." Maya felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as her role shifted from observer to active participant. She had spent the week studying the profiles of expected attendees, memorizing faces and potential threat indicators with a thoroughness that had once kept intelligence operatives alive in hostile territory. The Yamamoto security chief was a compact man in his 50s whose bearings suggested military training and extensive experience with protective operations. Maya met him at the main entrance, projecting confidence while maintaining the diplomatic courtesy required when armed professionals assessed each other's capabilities. "You have done impressive work with the space," he said in accented English, his eyes systematically cataloging the defensive positions that had been disguised as architectural features. "Your principal is fortunate to have acquired someone with your qualifications." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication that she belonged to Jinwoo rather than working with him, but she maintained professional composure while guiding the inspection tour. The careful choreography of the security assessment reminded her of formal military protocols, where potential enemies evaluated each other's strength while maintaining the fiction of cooperative engagement. When the tour concluded without incident, Maya found herself alone in the main space as the various security teams established their positions for the evening's negotiations. The transformation of the warehouse was complete, utilitarian space converted into something that projected both luxury and subtle threat. Jinwoo appeared beside her with the soundless approach that had initially unnerved her but now felt familiar, another sign of his presence that she had learned to anticipate rather than fear. "The other participants will begin arriving within the hour," he said, his voice carrying satisfaction with the preparations they had completed together. Maya nodded, checking her watch against the timeline they had developed for managing the arrival sequence that would minimize opportunities for conflict while the various delegations established their positions. "Everything is in place," she replied, though part of her remained alert for variables that could not be controlled through preparation and planning. Jinwoo stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood scent that had become associated in her mind with safety and danger in equal measure. "There is something else," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note she had not heard before. "Something personal I need to discuss with you before we begin." Maya turned to face him, noting the way his usual composure seemed slightly strained, as if whatever he wanted to say required effort that went beyond his normal calculated communication. The warehouse around them hummed with activity as security teams completed final preparations, but their immediate space felt isolated, private despite the dozens of armed professionals within shouting distance. My father established the territorial agreements we are renegotiating tonight, Jinwoo began, his gaze fixed on something beyond her shoulder, as if looking at her directly would make the words more difficult. He believed that honor and tradition were more important than profit, that our obligations to family and community outweighed personal desires. Maya remained silent, sensing that he was sharing something significant, personal revelation that went beyond the tactical information they had exchanged over the past week. I have followed his principles since inheriting leadership, Jinwoo continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence he used when discussing philosophy. Duty before desire, obligation before personal fulfillment, the needs of the organization before individual wants. He finally met her gaze, and Maya felt her breath catch at the intensity she saw there, something raw and honest that contrasted sharply with his usual controlled presentation. But this week, working with you, planning these operations together, he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, I have begun to question whether such rigid adherence to duty serves any purpose beyond preventing the possibility of genuine connection. Maya felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not literally, but emotionally, as if the careful professional distance they had maintained was cracking under the weight of acknowledged attraction. She had spent the past week telling herself that the warmth in his glances and the careful attention to her comfort were simply courtesy, nothing more significant than good manners from a man raised with traditional values. Jinwoo, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to respond to honesty that laid bare the growing tension between them, without crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. Before she could formulate an appropriate response, Chinwoo's voice crackled through the communication system that connected all security personnel. Unknown vehicle approaching perimeter, he announced with the clipped precision that indicated potential threat. Single occupant, no advance notification. Maya felt Jinwoo's demeanor shift instantly from personal vulnerability to professional alertness, his entire body language transforming as operational priorities superseded emotional concerns. She followed him toward the communications center, her own training automatically cataloging exit routes and defensive positions. The security monitors showed a black motorcycle approaching the warehouse entrance at high speed, its rider wearing a helmet that concealed identification. Maya's tactical assessment identified multiple problems with the scenario. Motorcycles allowed rapid approach and departure. Single riders were harder to track and verify, and the timing suggested either poor planning or deliberate provocation. Chunwoo appeared beside them, his hand resting on his concealed weapon while maintaining the casual posture required to avoid escalating tension unnecessarily. The bike stopped at the security checkpoint, the rider removing their helmet to reveal a woman in her 30s with the kind of sharp features that suggested intelligence and determination in equal measure. "Do you know her?" Maya asked Jinwoo, noting the way his expression had shifted to something approaching recognition mixed with concern. "Keiko Tanaka," he replied, his voice carrying grim understanding of implications that Maya could not yet grasp. "She works for the Osaka Syndicate, specializing in intelligence gathering and what might politely be called targeted persuasion." Maya watched the monitors as the woman presented credentials to the security team, her movements confident despite being surrounded by armed professionals whose loyalty clearly lay elsewhere. There was something predatory in her attention to detail, the way she cataloged faces and positions with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to identify weakness and exploit it. "She is here for you," Jinwoo said quietly, his gaze fixed on Maya's face rather than the screens showing the woman's approach. "The restaurant incident created questions about your identity and qualifications that certain interested parties would like answered directly." Maya felt ice form in her stomach as she understood the implications. Her carefully constructed cover had been compromised not just with Jinwoo's organization, but with rivals who viewed her as a potential source of intelligence about his operations, vulnerabilities, and plans. The woman entered the warehouse with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room, her dark clothing and tactical accessories, suggesting preparation for violence despite the supposedly diplomatic nature of the evening's proceedings. She approached their position near the communications center with deliberate intent, her gaze fixed on Maya with the intensity of a predator who had located particularly interesting prey. "Miss Chun," Keiko said in English accented with the kind of precision that suggested extensive international training. "I understand you have recently begun consulting on security matters. Perhaps you would be interested in discussing alternative employment opportunities." Maya felt Jinwoo's presence beside her like heat from a furnace, his body language shifting into something that radiated lethal intent despite his outwardly calm demeanor. The possessiveness in his stance surprised her, protective instinct that went far beyond professional concern for a valuable asset. "Miss Chun is currently under my exclusive employment," Jinwoo replied, his voice carrying the kind of controlled menace that made experienced criminals reconsider their plans. "Perhaps your principals would be interested in discussing territorial boundaries instead of attempting to recruit personnel during diplomatic proceedings." Keiko smiled with predatory appreciation, clearly recognizing the threat implicit in Jinwoo's response while remaining unimpressed by his attempt to establish dominance through verbal intimidation. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I merely wanted to ensure she understood that talented individuals always have options in our industry." Maya stepped forward, positioning herself between the two potential combatants with the kind of movement that established her agency rather than her need for protection. She met Keiko's gaze directly, projecting confidence while internally calculating the woman's capabilities and potential threat level. "I appreciate the interest," Maya said with diplomatic courtesy that concealed her growing anger being discussed, as if she were property to be negotiated rather than a person capable of making her own decisions. "However, I am satisfied with my current arrangement." Keiko's smile widened, suggesting she found Maya's response more interesting than disappointing. "Should circumstances change," she said, producing a business card with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to making offers that could not be safely refused, "I trust you will remember that alternatives exist." She departed with the same confident stride, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive perfume and barely contained violence. Maya found herself hyper-aware of Jinwoo's proximity, the way his protective instincts had been triggered by another predator's interest in something he had come to consider his own. The realization should have concerned her more than it did. Instead, she found herself oddly pleased by his possessive response, the way he had positioned himself as her shield against threats she was perfectly capable of handling independently. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his hand hovering near her elbow in a gesture that offered comfort while remaining respectful of her autonomy. Maya looked up at him, noting the way his dark eyes searched her face for signs of distress or uncertainty. She realized that somewhere over the past week, his protection had stopped feeling like captivity and started feeling like partnership, his concern for her safety evolving from professional necessity into something far more personal. "I am fine," she replied, though she moved slightly closer to him, accepting the shelter of his presence while maintaining her independence. "But I think we both understand that neutrality is no longer an option in this world." Jinwoo's expression softened with something that looked almost like relief, as if her acknowledgement of their shared situation had resolved questions he had been afraid to ask directly. The evening's negotiations proceeded without further incident, but Maya found herself intensely aware of Jinwoo's attention throughout the complex diplomatic dance of establishing territorial boundaries and profit-sharing agreements. His gaze seemed to find her regularly, checking her position and status with the kind of protective surveillance that should have felt oppressive but instead felt cherished. When the last delegation departed near midnight, leaving behind signed agreements that would maintain peace for the foreseeable future, Maya realized that she had stopped thinking of her arrangement with Jinwoo as temporary necessity and started considering it as chosen partnership. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The intelligence arrived at 4 in the morning through encrypted channels that Jinwoo monitored from his position in the communications center, digital intercepts that painted a picture of coordinated violence planned with military precision. Maya studied the tactical assessment, while Jinwoo paced the length of his office, his usual controlled demeanor cracking under the weight of information that transformed their careful security preparations into desperate defensive measures. 24 operatives, Jinwoo said, his voice carrying the flat tone he used when processing threats that exceeded normal parameters. Explosives, heavy weapons, and coordination that suggests either military training or extensive intelligence gathering about our defensive capabilities. Maya absorbed the details with a systematic analysis that had once kept special operations teams alive in environments where enemies possessed superior numbers and intimate knowledge of local terrain. The attack would begin at dawn, using multiple breach points to overwhelm their security response and create chaos sufficient to allow assassination teams access to Jinwoo's personal quarters. They know our routines, our shift changes, our evacuation protocols, she said, tracing the proposed assault pattern across the building schematics that covered his desk like battle plans. This level of intelligence suggests either extensive surveillance or information provided by someone with inside access. Jinwoo stopped pacing, his attention focusing on implications that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. The possibility of betrayal within his organization represented a threat that could not be neutralized through superior firepower or defensive positioning, requiring the kind of careful investigation that demanded time they did not possess. Chunwoo entered the office without knocking, his expression carrying the grim urgency that preceded announcements of escalating crisis. "We have confirmation of explosive devices being moved into position around the building perimeter," he reported in Korean before switching to English for Maya's benefit. Estimates suggest enough destructive power to compromise structural integrity of the lower floors. Maya felt the familiar calm that descended during crisis situations, training overriding fear to create the mental clarity necessary for tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. "They are not planning capture or interrogation," she observed, studying the intelligence reports with professional detachment. "This is designed for complete elimination, everyone in the building." The realization hit Jinwoo like a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal genuine fear that had nothing to do with personal survival and everything to do with responsibility for the lives of people who depended on his protection. "We evacuate immediately," he said, reaching for his phone to begin coordinating the complex logistics required to move essential personnel to secure locations. "Everyone leaves except minimal security to maintain surveillance and document the attack for future retaliation." Maya stepped between him and the communications equipment, her movement decisive enough to halt his preparations. "You cannot run from this," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "If you abandon your headquarters, you abandon your position. Your enemies will interpret evacuation as weakness, and weakness in your world invites additional attacks until they succeed in destroying everything you have built." Jinwoo stared at her as if she had suggested tactical suicide, his dark eyes reflecting the kind of desperation that came from being forced to choose between impossible alternatives. 24 trained operatives against our current defensive capability," he said. "The mathematics favor complete annihilation." Maya met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of confidence that had been forged in situations where retreat meant death and victory required accepting risks that rational analysis would reject. "Not if we change the parameters," she replied. "They are planning to attack a static defense with overwhelming force. We give them a dynamic engagement where their numbers become a liability instead of an advantage." She moved to the building schematics, her mind automatically generating solutions that transformed defensive disadvantages into tactical opportunities. "We use their intelligence against them," she continued, tracing modified defensive positions that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. "They expect us to defend from prepared positions. Instead, we allow them to breach the perimeter, then collapse their formations using the building's infrastructure as a weapon." Chunwoo leaned forward, his expression shifting from skeptical to intrigued as he followed her tactical reasoning. "You are suggesting we turn the building into a trap," he said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. Maya nodded, adrenaline sharpening her focus as operational planning displaced emotional concerns. "They have explosives positioned to destroy structural supports," she explained, her finger tracing blast patterns across the architectural drawings. "We detonate those charges ourselves at the moment when their assault teams are positioned where falling debris will cause maximum casualties." Jinwoo studied her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of what she was proposing, the level of risk that her plan required from everyone involved. "You are asking me to gamble everything on timing and precision," he said quietly. "If the calculations are wrong, we all die." Maya felt the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders, the familiar burden of making tactical decisions that would determine whether people lived or died, but also the exhilaration of returning to work that mattered, where her skills could make the difference between survival and destruction. "If we evacuate, you lose your position and spend the rest of your life running from enemies who will never stop hunting you," she replied. "If we stay and execute this plan correctly, we eliminate the threat permanently and establish your reputation as someone too dangerous to challenge." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of preparations being made throughout the building as security teams implemented standard defensive protocols that would prove inadequate against the approaching assault. "I cannot ask you to stay," Jinwoo said finally, his voice carrying pain that went beyond tactical concerns. "This is not your war, not your obligation. You have done more than enough to repay any debt created by the restaurant incident." Maya felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, emotion that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious that he could not bear to lose. "You are not asking," she said firmly. "I am choosing. This became my war the moment I decided your life was worth protecting." The honesty in her words seemed to hit Jinwoo like a physical force, his carefully controlled facade finally cracking completely to reveal the depth of feeling he had been fighting since the night they met. Before he could respond, the building's alarm system activated with piercing electronic wails that announced the beginning of an assault designed to leave no survivors. The first explosions came from the underground parking garage, structural charges that sent tremors through the building's foundation and filled the air with concrete dust and the acrid smell of high explosives. Maya felt the floor vibrate beneath her feet as 42 stories of steel and glass absorbed impacts that had been calculated to compromise but not completely destroy the building's integrity. Emergency lighting activated as the main power grid failed, bathing everything in red illumination that transformed familiar spaces into something from a war zone. Maya moved toward the communications center where Chunwoo was coordinating defensive responses, her mind automatically shifting into combat mode that pushed emotional concerns aside in favor of tactical priorities. Jinwoo followed, his presence beside her solid and reassuring despite the chaos erupting around them. Through the reinforced windows, they could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as attacking forces engaged the perimeter security teams in firefights that lit up the pre-dawn darkness with lethal fireworks. "Breach in the south stairwell," Chunwoo reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. 8 hostiles moving up from the parking level. Additional forces attempting entry through the loading dock and service entrances. Maya studied the tactical display that showed enemy positions relative to their defensive preparations, noting the way attacking forces had dispersed to prevent concentrated defensive fire while maintaining coordinated pressure on multiple access points. "They are following the assault plan exactly as intelligence predicted," she observed, feeling grim satisfaction that their enemy's precision would become their weakness. "Initiate fallback to secondary positions and prepare for controlled structural collapse on my signal." The next 20 minutes unfolded with the brutal efficiency of well-trained professionals attempting to kill each other in an environment designed to amplify violence rather than contain it. Maya found herself moving through the building with Jinwoo beside her, both of them armed and coordinating defensive actions that channeled attacking forces into positions where the building itself could be weaponized against them. She had forgotten the intimate partnership that could develop between people fighting for their lives, the way crisis created absolute trust and perfect communication without the need for words. Jinwoo anticipated her movements with preternatural accuracy, covering her approaches and supporting her tactical decisions with the kind of seamless cooperation that usually required months of training to achieve. When the assault reached its climax, with enemy forces positioned throughout the building's middle floors in preparation for their final push toward Jinwoo's penthouse, Maya triggered the charges that brought down carefully selected structural supports in a sequence designed to create maximum devastation while preserving escape routes for friendly forces. The building screamed as tons of concrete and steel collapsed with thunderous violence that could be heard for miles. Maya felt the vibration through her bones as their trap closed with mathematical precision, crushing the assault teams beneath debris that had been turned into a weapon through careful calculation and desperate courage. In the aftermath, as dust settled and emergency silence replaced the cacophony of combat, Maya realized she had been holding Jinwoo's hand without conscious awareness, their fingers interlaced with the kind of desperate grip that people used when they feared being separated by forces beyond their control. The final confrontation came as they moved through the wreckage toward the exit route they had prepared for extraction. Keiko Tanaka emerged from behind a fallen support beam, her dark clothing torn and bloodied, but her weapon steady as she aimed directly at Jinwoo's center mass. "Impressive tactical work," she said, her voice carrying grudging respect despite her obvious intent to complete her mission regardless of the cost. "Unfortunately, my employers require confirmation that certain contracts have been fulfilled." Maya moved without thinking, placing herself between the weapon and Jinwoo with the kind of instinctive protection that had nothing to do with tactical analysis and everything to do with the way love could transform rational people into shields willing to absorb any amount of damage to protect what mattered most. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, echoing off concrete surfaces with the kind of finality that announced the end of negotiations and the beginning of consequences that could not be undone. Maya felt the impact as fire spreading through her left shoulder, the familiar sensation of a bullet finding flesh and bone with destructive precision. She remained upright through pure determination, her training allowing her to function despite injury that sent shock waves of pain through her entire nervous system. Jinwoo's response was immediate and absolute. His weapon appeared in his hand with fluid grace, firing twice with the kind of accuracy that came from years of practice and the motivation that arose from watching someone precious being harmed by enemies who deserved no mercy. Keiko dropped without making another sound, her mission incomplete and her life forfeit to the mathematics of violence that governed their world. Maya felt her legs give way as adrenaline finally surrendered to blood loss and trauma that could no longer be ignored through willpower alone. Jinwoo caught her before she could hit the debris-covered floor, his arms supporting her weight with gentle strength that contrasted sharply with the lethal efficiency he had just demonstrated. She looked up at his face, noting the way his usual controlled expression had been replaced by something raw and terrified that revealed the depth of his emotional investment more clearly than any declaration could have accomplished. "You cannot die," he said quietly, his voice carrying desperation that went far beyond tactical concerns. "I will not allow it." Maya felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with blood loss and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered, the center around which his carefully constructed life had begun to revolve. "I am not planning to die," she replied, though speaking required effort that suggested her injury was more serious than she had initially assessed. "But I think we both understand that everything has changed between us." Jinwoo's expression softened with something that looked like relief mixed with wonder, as if her acknowledgement of their emotional connection had resolved fears he had not dared voice even to himself. As emergency sirens wailed in the distance and dawn light began to filter through the shattered windows of their temporary fortress, Maya realized that survival had become less important than the recognition that they had found something worth protecting that went far beyond professional arrangements or tactical partnerships. They had found each other, and neither was willing to let go, regardless of what dangers tomorrow might bring. The private medical suite on the 38th floor had been designed for discretion rather than comfort, but Jinwoo had transformed it into something that resembled a luxury recovery room through careful attention to details that spoke of devotion rather than mere medical necessity. Fresh flowers replaced the antiseptic smell of hospital equipment, while soft lighting eliminated the harsh fluorescent glare that made healing feel clinical rather than restorative. Maya woke to find him sitting beside her bed, his usually immaculate appearance softened by exhaustion and the kind of stubble that suggested he had not left her side since the surgery that had extracted Keiko's bullet from muscle and bone with millimeter precision. His dark eyes were focused on her face with an intensity that made her feel cherished rather than monitored. "How long?" she asked, her voice hoarse from anesthesia and the breathing tube that had sustained her through 6 hours of surgical repair that had required calling in specialists who asked no questions and left no records. "For days," Jinwoo replied, his hand finding hers with gentle pressure that conveyed relief too profound for words. "The surgeon said you would have full mobility once the healing is complete, no permanent damage to muscle function or nerve response." Maya shifted carefully, testing the range of motion in her injured shoulder while noting the way Jinwoo's attention tracked every movement as if cataloging signs of pain or discomfort that might require immediate intervention. His protective focus should have felt oppressive, but instead it felt like being wrapped in warmth that had nothing to do with medical recovery and everything to do with being precious to someone who possessed the power to ensure her absolute safety. "The threats," she said, though part of her already knew the answer from the way he had relaxed into something approaching peace during their conversation. "Eliminated," Jinwoo confirmed, his voice carrying satisfaction that went beyond tactical success. "Keiko's employers discovered that continuing their campaign against us would be prohibitively expensive after losing 24 operatives and their most experienced field agent. They have agreed to territorial boundaries that formalize our previous arrangements while acknowledging our demonstrated capability for decisive retaliation." Maya felt relief settle into her bones along with the lingering effects of prescription pain management that made everything feel slightly distant but perfectly clear. The external pressures that had defined their relationship since the restaurant attack had been neutralized, leaving them free to determine their future based on choice rather than survival necessity. "Which means," Jinwoo continued carefully, his voice taking on formal tones that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation during the long hours of maintaining vigil beside her bed, "that you are no longer bound by the protection arrangement we established. Your safety has been secured through our victory, and you have more than fulfilled any obligation created by your initial intervention on my behalf." Maya studied his face, noting the way his controlled expression concealed deeper emotions that he was afraid to reveal without explicit permission. She recognized the careful distance he was establishing, offering her freedom while clearly hoping she would choose to stay, protecting himself from the pain of rejection by maintaining professional courtesy that felt forced after everything they had shared. "Are you releasing me from my employment contract?" she asked, though they both understood she was really asking whether he wanted her to leave now that external circumstances no longer required her presence in his dangerous world. "I am offering you the choice you were denied when survival made our arrangement necessary," Jinwoo replied, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of what he was proposing. "You can return to the life you built before our worlds collided, with financial resources that will ensure your security and anonymity. Or you can remain, but as my partner rather than my employee, sharing the responsibilities and risks that come with building something permanent together." Maya felt her heart accelerate with anticipation that had nothing to do with medical recovery and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, as if her decision would determine whether his future contained happiness or resigned solitude. She had spent 4 days suspended between dreams and consciousness, processing not just physical trauma, but the emotional revelation that she no longer wanted safety if it meant separation from the man who had become essential to her existence in ways that transcended rational analysis. Partners in what capacity? She asked, wanting to hear him articulate the full scope of what he was offering rather than making assumptions about his intentions. Jinwoo rose from his chair and moved to the window that overlooked the city where they had fought for survival and found something worth protecting that went beyond their individual lives. In every capacity, he said quietly, his voice carrying conviction that suggested he had made peace with desires that had once conflicted with his sense of duty and obligation. He turned back to face her, and Maya saw vulnerability in his expression that made her understand how much courage this conversation required from someone who had learned to equate emotional revelation with potentially fatal weakness. I want you as my partner in the business decisions that affect thousands of people who depend on our organization for their livelihoods. He continued, each word carefully chosen but delivered with increasing confidence. I want you as my partner in the security arrangements that protect everyone under our care from enemies who will always exist in our chosen world. And I want you as my partner in the private moments that make survival worthwhile, the domestic peace that transforms houses into homes, and professional arrangements into marriages that last beyond tactical convenience. Maya felt tears start in her eyes, not from pain, but from recognition that he was offering her everything she had not dared hope for when their relationship began as protection that felt like captivity. Partnership that preserved her autonomy while acknowledging their interdependence. Love that strengthened rather than diminished her individual capabilities. You're asking me to marry you, she said, wanting clarity about what accepting his proposal would mean in practical terms rather than just emotional ones. I am asking you to choose a life where we face whatever comes together, Jinwoo replied, stepping closer to her bedside with the kind of careful approach that suggested he was prepared for rejection but hoping desperately for acceptance. Where your strength complements mine, where your tactical expertise shapes our defensive preparations, where your presence transforms mere survival into something worth defending with absolute dedication. Maya looked at him, standing beside her hospital bed, noting the way morning light from the windows caught the planes of his face and revealed the man who existed beneath the carefully constructed facade of dangerous authority. She thought about the small apartment she had abandoned, the anonymous life that had felt like wearing clothes 3 sizes too small, the careful mediocrity that had protected her from notice but prevented her from being truly alive. Then she thought about the past week, the way their professional partnership had evolved into something that felt like perfect compatibility, the way his presence had become associated with safety and challenge in equal measure, the way protecting him had felt less like obligation and more like defending something precious that belonged to both of them. I accept, she said simply, watching his controlled expression transform into something that looked like pure joy mixed with relief, so profound it made her understand how much her decision meant to him. Jinwoo leaned down to kiss her forehead with gentle reverence that spoke of devotion rather than mere affection, his lips warm against her skin as he sealed their commitment with physical tenderness that promised protection and partnership in equal measure. The recovery period that followed established rhythms that would define their future together. Mornings spent planning security arrangements for business operations that had evolved to include her tactical input as standard protocol. Afternoons devoted to the complex negotiations required to maintain peace in a world where power attracted constant challenges from ambitious competitors. But it was the private moments that convinced Maya she had made the right choice. Evenings when Jinwoo prepared dinner with the same precise attention he applied to everything else while she reviewed intelligence reports that would inform their defensive preparations. Domestic tranquility that coexisted with professional danger without contradiction. 6 months later, Maya stood in the observation deck of the rebuilt warehouse. Watching Jinwoo coordinate a security briefing that would determine protective protocols for expansion into new territorial arrangements that had become possible after their demonstrated capability for decisive action against serious threats. She wore a platinum ring that had replaced the employment contract as symbol of their arrangement, but the weight on her finger felt like freedom rather than obligation, chosen commitment rather than circumstance-forced proximity. Jinwoo approached her position with a respectful deference that had replaced his initial skepticism about her qualifications, carrying tactical assessments that bore her signature alongside Jinwoo's formal approval. The Portland delegation has agreed to our security requirements. He reported in English that acknowledged her equal partnership in operational decisions. They understand that protective arrangements are non-negotiable aspects of any business relationship with our organization. Maya nodded, reviewing the documents while noting the way Jinwoo's attention found her across the room with the kind of automatic surveillance that had evolved from protective vigilance into the comfortable awareness that came from choosing to share lives as well as dangers. For those watching tonight from places where love and danger intertwine like silk and steel, she thought, recognizing the way their story might inspire others to believe that protection could transform into partnership, that surrender could become a form of power, that choosing to stay could be more liberating than choosing to run. The business of maintaining their position in a world where weakness invited destruction continued with the same careful attention to detail that had always defined Jinwoo's approach to survival. But now Maya's voice carried equal weight in decisions that affected everyone under their protection. As evening approached and the various security teams dispersed to implement arrangements they had developed together, Maya found herself alone with Jinwoo in the space where they had first acknowledged that professional necessity had evolved into something that transcended rational analysis. He approached her with a measured pace that had once suggested predatory assessment, but now felt like the comfortable approach of someone who belonged wherever she was, whose presence completed rather than threatened her sense of security. Any regrets? He asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer from the way she had integrated herself into every aspect of their shared existence. Maya stepped into his arms, allowing herself to be enveloped by the sandalwood scent that had become associated with home rather than danger, protection rather than possession. Only that it took us so long to understand what we were building together, she replied, meaning every word. Outside the windows, Seattle's lights sparkled like scattered diamonds across a landscape where power and love coexisted in careful balance, where protection had become partnership and partnership had become the kind of commitment that could weather any storm their enemies might devise. They had chosen each other, and everything else would follow from that fundamental decision to transform necessity into devotion, survival into something worth defending with absolute dedication.